Society constructs barriers to the contributions of women, and today I'm going to tell you how to reduce those. But first, I want to tell you about Ellen. Ellen was born in Liberia, where the literacy rate for women is around 50%, much like the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. Ellen's grandmother was a poor, illiterate woman, struggling to raise her only child after she'd been abandoned by her husband. Then a well-off couple, who had no children of their own, offered to take in Ellen's mother, raise her as their own, and give her a good education. Ellen's mother married and did well until Ellen's father had a severe stroke and was disabled in his early 40s. Ellen's mother became the sole support of the family. Because she had an education, she was able to keep the family afloat and all of her children in school. Ellen did very well, graduating from college and eventually receiving a scholarship to Harvard, where she received her master's in public administration. Ellen returned to Liberia and worked in government. Civil war broke out, brutal dictatorship took over. Ellen spoke out on multiple occasions against government oppression and was imprisoned twice for doing so. Then, in 2005, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected president of Liberia. In 2011, she was both re-elected and shared the Nobel Peace Prize for her work on women's rights. Education alleviates poverty within a generation. And because women invest more in the education and health of their children, we've seen the prosperity of whole nations rise when women are educated. 2/3 of the illiterate adults in this world are women. Imagine the contributions these 500 million women could make if they were educated. In the developed world, women encounter different barriers. When Sandra Day O'Connor graduated from Stanford Law School, right near the top of her class, no law firm would offer her a job as a lawyer. One offered her a job as a legal secretary. This kind of bias would be shocking and illegal today. Today, women still encounter barriers, but they're more subtle. Men have barriers too, but today we're talking about women. But first, I want to give you a quiz. I'm a professor, I can't resist. One question. Okay, this is it. There's a serious car accident. 2 people involved. The father is killed, the young son is seriously injured. He's rushed to the hospital, taken straight into surgery. The surgeon walks in, looks at him, and says, "I can't do this surgery. This is my son." How can this be? Raise your hand if you know the answer. Leave your hand up if you know the answer and you've never heard the question before. Okay. Tell me what the answer is.
The surgeon was the child's mother.
That's right. If you didn't know the answer to this question, what you were just experienced was implicit bias. Implicit bias is the first of 3 barriers that I want to discuss that women experience in the developed world. It's unconscious, we don't know we have it, but it's pervasive. In hiring, we hear the phrase, "I know quality when I see it." But this is fraught with implicit bias. Why? Because quality becomes like a mirror that looks just like it's always looked in the past. It's more difficult to see quality in someone that looks different. We know that implicit bias is pervasive because of resume studies. These have been replicated many times where a job is selected, resume developed, half the resumes have a male name, the other half have a female name. Large groups of people are asked to respond on how well qualified this person is for the job. Consistently, both men and women rate the resume with the male name as more qualified than the identical resume with a female name. Why is this so? We make poor decisions because we're blinded by our bias. This study's been replicated many times using different jobs, including police officer, university department chair, and most recently, scientist, all with the same results. I encourage you to test yourself. Go to this website, implicit.harvard.edu. We essentially all have some bias, just a matter of degree. But it's difficult to recognize this bias in ourselves without objective information. But once we do acknowledge we have some bias, we can work to reduce it, and we can compensate for that remains. And I'm going to give you 2 ways that you can compensate. One is when you're in an evaluative situation, if you develop specific objective criteria in advance and use that consistently to evaluate each person, you can reduce the bias. Another way is to hide the identity of the applicant prior to evaluating. Symphony orchestras have used this very effectively. What they do is they put a screen up and have the musician audition from behind it. And that way, the evaluators can only hear the music and make their decision on that. Symphony orchestras started out with 10% women musicians until they started implementing this procedure, and they went up to 35% afterwards. You can make a difference by identifying your own bias and working to reduce it. The National Science Foundation, or NSF, which distributes large amounts of grant funding for research on science and engineering, became concerned about these issues, particularly about their observation that the US is experiencing significant ongoing shortages in the workforce of science and engineering. And this is a concern because it threatens the competitiveness of the United States in the global marketplace. They also observed that we lose women in science and engineering fields at every juncture in the education and career path. And they determined that if we could keep the women that started in these fields, we could essentially eliminate this shortage. So what did NSF do? They developed grant programs. That's what they always do. One of these programs was the Advance program. Here they asked teams of faculty at their university to develop proposals on how they would change their university so that they did a better job of improving the participation and advancement of women in science and engineering. I led a team that applied for and received one of these grants. We started by focusing on the second barrier, organizational culture. What we observed in the data at our university was that women were leaving science and engineering positions at twice the rate of men. When we examined our survey data, we found that women started to look for a new job when they found themselves in negative or hostile department cultures. I saw these departures like canaries in the mines as a symptom of serious problems in the department. We began doing interviews, and one senior woman said to me, "I've always felt isolated in this department. And it's not that people mean to isolate me, it's just that there are all these different relationships or clubs going on, and you don't make it in for unknown reasons." I'm going to tell you a personal story, particularly tragic, about a woman I'll call Shelley. I met Shelley at a Christmas party. She was a general surgery resident. She was the only woman in her program, the only one that wasn't married. She'd moved over 1,000 miles across the country to take this position, far from family and friends. She was working the normal 80 to 100 hours a week, including every third night on call at the hospital, making it difficult to develop relationships outside of work. As I talked to her, I could feel that she was feeling excluded and isolated at work. Her particular concern at that moment was Christmas. She couldn't go home because she had to work Christmas Day. And she gradually alluded to the fact that she had no place to go for Christmas Eve. So of course I invited her to my house. We had a pleasant evening, and some months later, we didn't interact for several months until I got word that she'd been hospitalized after a very serious suicide attempt. Fortunately, she recovered. She transferred to a more supportive family practice residency and became a practicing physician. But it doesn't have to be this way. Our small advanced team, without any status or authority, with some resources and lots of hard work, pulled in other people to help us, did department retreats, collaborative projects, a number of different initiatives, and we were able, over the course of that grant, to document improvements in the recruitment, retention, and advancement of women faculty. You can be part of the solution as well. Right now, I want each of you to think about your workplace or any organization you're affiliated with. Think of somebody that might be excluded or isolated. Nod your head when you've got somebody in mind. Okay, now I want you to think of something you're going to do to make a difference to that person. Stop and visit, pass on information, do something socially. Now, some of you are thinking, yeah, I thought of something, but somebody, but they're kind of irritable, not somebody I want to hang out with. Isolation does that to people. Shelley told me there were days that she was really grouchy, but it was just so hard to act happy. Do it anyway. Now next, I want to move to a little bit larger level. Here you see that women have been receiving advanced degrees over the last 4 or 5 decades, so that in these disciplines, accounting, law, medicine, PhDs, they're essentially equal to men, 46 to 54%. Now let's look at the rate that women are achieving the top levels in these professions. Rates of 15 to 33%. Not quite what you'd expect, probably. This suggests that barriers are still present. And this points to the final barrier that I want to discuss with you today. The ideal worker assumption. Oops. This is an assumption that's been in place for decades. It kind of underlies organizations. And it assumes that the ideal worker is someone who has a wife at home that takes care of all the home details, freeing the worker to dedicate his full commitment to his career. However, the world has changed since this era, hasn't it? Today, there are many dual career couples who both want to make important contributions at home and at work. Furthermore, most professions require intense hours early in the career. Lawyers and accountants put in grueling hours to make partner. Medical students face intense residencies. And academics strive to beat the tenure clock. When does this happen? Right during the prime years for family formation and childbearing, requiring most women to make significant sacrifices to follow this path. For example, when women do make it to the highest level of academics, full professor, they're less likely to be married than men. And if they are married, many report having fewer children than they wanted. When accountants try and take a break from their career in order to have a child, over 90% of them report that they want to return to their career within 2 years. But those that try, less than 50% are able to do it. Why? Because they're seriously marginalized for wanting to work less. They're judged as uncommitted. When we have a society where one of the major regrets of those at the end of life is that they wish they hadn't worked so hard, it may be time to rethink this extreme value placed on commitment, especially when that's measured in terms of number of hours at the office. This is a big issue that would benefit from many, many people raising questions and asking about the possibility of framing work differently. My own experience made me sensitive to these issues early on. As I finished my master's program, I went with my 2-year-old in hand to inquire about the possibility of getting a PhD. The program officer looked at me and said rather gruffly, "We don't hire our own graduates, and we require you to attend full-time in this program." Did he have implicit bias? Well, at very minimum, I believe he was actively trying to discourage me. It worked. I did not apply. So 11 years later, when the youngest of my now 4 children was in preschool, my passion for learning and my deep desire to make a contribution propelled me once again to apply for a PhD program. This time I was accepted. I started with great enthusiasm. Some weeks into the first year, my department decided to have a barbecue. They invited faculty, graduate students, and their family. Only 3 of my children wanted to go, so we went. And when I got there, without anyone saying a word, I could see the doubt in their eyes. And I went home seriously shaken, wondering if I could really do what I'd set out to do. This stayed with me for some time until news broke that historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich had won the Pulitzer Prize for her work, A Midwife's Tale. I knew Laurel, and I remembered that she had finished her PhD with 5 children. This was all I needed, was to know that somebody else had done what I was trying to do. And not only done it, but been really successful. I went forward with greater confidence. This university still had the same rules. You were required to attend full-time, but this time, I bent the rules. I never attended full-time. I took a little longer to finish than some of my peers, and I'll be forever grateful to those faculty that went along with my rule-bending proposals and allowed me to follow my dreams. Each of us can make efforts to remove these barriers by reducing our own implicit bias, by working with others to improve our organizational culture so they're supportive places to work, and challenge the ideal worker model. All with the goal of allowing both men and women to make the contributions they desire. Thank you.